Mic check. 1, 2, 3. Mic check.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Joaquin Esquivel. I'm chair of the State Water Resources Control Board. Today is Wednesday, February 22nd. It is 9:31 a.m., and I would like to call this meeting to order. First, I'd like to introduce my fellow colleagues with me here today. We have our Vice Chair, Doreen D'Adamo, Board Member Sean McGuire, and Board Member Nicole Morgan. With us today as well as our Executive Director, Eileen Sobek, our Chief Counsel, Michael Loffer, our two Chief Deputies, Jonathan Bishop and Eric Oppenheimer. Our Acting Clerk of the Board is Courtney Tyler, and assisting her today is Michael Reed and Margie Argel. As you can see, this meeting is being webcast and recorded. It's a hybrid meeting, so you're either participating one of two ways. If you're participating remotely, you might be on our traditional webcast on the Cali PA website or on YouTube Live. But if you intend on commenting on any of the items on today's board agenda, you should be on the Zoom platform. There are instructions on how to do so at the top of today's agenda. But if you're having any challenges on getting onto the platform, please do email our clerk of the board at board.clerk@waterboards.ca.gov, and she'll help get you onto the platform. Once you are on the platform, your camera will be off, you'll be on mute until it is your turn to speak on the item that you've indicated to do so. For those of you in the room, good morning, good to see you all. We're here in the Cali PA building in Sacramento. Just a couple of quick announcements for you all as well. Please do observe the exits here. If there is an emergency for whatever reason, we'll calmly file out to Cesar Chavez Plaza and await any further directions. Also, if you intend on commenting on any of today's items, there's a QR code at the side of the room here, or you can talk to the clerk in order to get put onto our speaker card. Once you do come up, please do indicate your name if you're with any organization. Lastly, if you don't mind all silencing your phones so that there's not any disruptions during our discussion today. Today we begin our meeting actually with a presentation of Superior Accomplishment Awards. But before we do that, I did want to take a moment to note the passing of our Clerk of the Board, Janine Townsend. Janine passed over the weekend. I just want to thank everyone that came together and celebrated Janine at our last board meeting. And members of the public as well. Janine, as we all acknowledge then and know still yet, was an incredible part of this board and our functioning, and was the principal face for so many of the public when they engage with us here. So I just want to just thank Janine's family, Andrew and Hannah, for sharing so much of Janine with us for so long. So I just want to acknowledge that and thank everyone. With that, let's move on to our presentation of Superior Accomplishment Awards, and would like to call up Karen Mogus to present our first award.
Good morning, Chair Esquivel, members of the board. I'm Karen Mogus, Deputy Director, Division of Water Quality here at the State Water Board, and I am pleased as punch to be here today to not present an item for your consideration, just to present an award to one of my fabulous staff, Jeannie Mesha, who is a senior environmental scientist in the Division of Water Quality. Since 2015, Jeannie has managed the federally funded non-point source grant program, an $8 million per year federal grant program that supports state and regional board non-point source water quality control activities and funds local projects that restore the state's most polluted waterways. In any given year, Jeannie leads a team of state and regional board staff who together manage more than 50 multi-year grants, totaling in excess of $40 million. Jeannie has worked diligently to enhance productive coordination with US EPA and implement efficiencies in administering the grant program. Her efforts have led to significant reductions in reporting burden and data management, and most recently collaboration with the Division of Financial Assistance to develop new and innovative ways of using Clean Water SRF, State Revolving Fund, for non-point source projects. As if that weren't enough, in 2020, Jeannie also assumed the additional workload to develop and implement the statewide Vegetation Treatment General Order in just over a year. The order is designed to streamline permitting for wildfire preparedness activities while ensuring water quality is protected. Jeannie then developed an implementation program to efficiently enroll projects in the order, including coordination with CAL FIRE and the Board of Forestry to efficiently share data and conduct site visits to observe projects for effects on water quality. With her commitment, strong sense of purpose, ingenuity, excellent management skills, and drive, she has sustained and improved an essential funding program for the water boards while also creating an innovative permitting program for vegetation management. So please join me in congratulating Jeannie Mesha on her Sustained Superior Accomplishment Award and all of her achievements here at the State Board.
Thank you so much, Karen. And Jeannie, importantly, you for that incredible work. I know it is such a priority of this administration. I think of Secretary Crowfoot and his Cutting the Green Tape initiative and the work that you've done to actualize that, to reduce those reporting burdens, but also to really contribute to incredible goals like vegetation management. It's just thank you from the seat. So well deserved. Thank you, Jeannie. Yeah, we can take a quick photo here. Awkward tradition, the dais photo. Thank you. And we have one more award as well, and would like to call up Eric Lau to present that. Or I should say a series of awards, but to be presented by Eric.
Actually, I have three groups. Hi, my name is Eric Lau. I'm the Assistant Deputy Director with the Division of Administrative Services. Today, I have three groups of award recipients. Hold on, give me a second. That's what happens when you have a really complicated password.
Thank you, DIT.
Okay. Today I have three groups of award recipients. The first groups are receiving the Superior Accomplishment Gold Awards, and they are from the Contact Tracer Administrative Unit. The award recipients are Maxine Freeman and Christina Edwards. Maxine's on vacation today, so Lucia Neary is going to accept the award on her behalf. So in March of 2020, when Governor Newsom established a COVID-19 response team, it included contact tracing workforce expansion, and state agencies are redirecting existing state employees for the contact tracing effort needed to contact individuals who have been exposed to the COVID-19 and provide health, education, and guidance to help Californians prevent the spread of COVID-19. Aside from the first responders, the contact tracing was an essential tool and required these employees to use unique skills above and beyond their normal job duties. They often have to work under very difficult working conditions and with significant personal sacrifices. Maxine Freeman and Christina Edwards demonstrated leadership and maintained a positive attitude serving as coordinators for the Water Board's Contact Tracers team. In recognition of their participation as contact tracer team coordinators on the COVID-19 response teams, we present them the Gold Superior Accomplishment Award for the exceptional contribution to the state of California. So the next group of Superior Accomplishment Gold Award recipients are from the Human Resource Disability Unit. They're Laura Krensler, Betty Miles Carter, Carmen Harris, and Pune Jones. Well, in March 2020, again, with the COVID pandemic, The disability unit was assigned to administer the Water Board's COVID-19 response, and the pandemic presents unusual difficulties and obstacles that needed to be overcome to ensure services were provided to our Water Board's employees. Obviously, the pandemic created significant workload increase for this unit to manage. They had to provide notification to Water Board employees of entirely new processes, forms, leave entitlements, regulations, and was responsible for running these new processes. New leave entitlements introduced during the pandemic means this unit was responsible for the reporting, tracking, communications, and submit documentation to the State Controller's Office. The unit was also responsible for managing the COVID-19 on-site testing program to help prevent the spread of COVID-19 in our workspace. The disability unit went above and beyond to maintain the operational need of the water boards while responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. The unit absorbed duties that were not in anyone's duty statement and comply with constantly evolving regulations. In recognizing of the efforts demonstrated by the Human Resource Disability Unit, we present them the Gold Superior Accomplishment Award for their exceptional contribution to the state of California. And finally, we are presenting the Sustained Accomplishment Award to the Human Resource Transaction Unit. This is the payroll unit. The award recipients are Christy Glantz, Leslie Burworth Douglas, Araceli Palomino, Claudia De La Torre Ortiz, and Jessica Labyrin. In March 2020, while most of the water board staff moved to 100% telework, that approach doesn't work for the transaction payroll unit because their functions were deemed essential in-office workers since they have to access personal identifiable information and their business processes relied on paper hard copies. The payroll unit developed new processes and extra measures to meet payroll deadlines and not risk violating labor laws. Without compromising security, the team would often need to prepare themselves to leave at a moment's notice when the office is closed. This risk to their health and dedication to the employees of the water board clearly demonstrate commitment to the department and the services they provide. In recognition of their effort demonstrated by the transaction payroll unit, we present them the Sustained Accomplishment Award for their exceptional contribution to the state of California.
Really appreciate you taking and acknowledging and elevating, I know, what was a difficult period and work here for all of us with COVID, but the work that you all did was so critical to the just continued functioning of us as an institution. And so just very thankful to be able to acknowledge you all in this. And so if you want, we can take a quick photo up here then. And again, just thank you so much, Eric and DAS, for the acknowledgement of everyone. Thanks again to all the recipients, and thanks everyone for giving us that time, taking a few moments to ensure that we're able to acknowledge and thank. Again, it may seem this all comes together, but it takes thousands of employees to accomplish the board's work. So thanks everyone for that. We can now move on to public forum, and as we do move on to public forum, I do want to acknowledge that Director Namath will be part of our discussion on the drought item, along with discussion on the TUCP. So if there are any commenters in public forum that would like to, you can still deliver your comment, but just would flag that there would be more appropriate opportunity in our drought item. So with that, I believe we have two commenters, and our first is Regina Chicazola, joining us virtually. And then I believe joining us in person, we have John Eric.
Hello, this is Regina Chicazola calling with Save California Salmon. Hold on, I'll try to start my video and hopefully I will still be able to be on for the drought item. I didn't realize that you were actually discussing the TUCP or temporary urgency petition, but so I'll try to talk to that later, and sorry for that. But yeah, I just wanted to really encourage the board today to change course on actually trying to protect water quality and staying true to the racial equity resolution and action plan. As you know, Save California Salmon put countless hours into helping draft the racial equity action plan. And since then, we've looked at quite a lot of studies on who actually owns water rights in the state of California, and who is making money off of the farming and agriculture industry in California. And I'm sure it would not surprise the board to hear about, I think, over 90% of water right holders in the state of California are either corporations or people that are not people of color. And we are still staying true to the 1914 water laws, and we're not staying true to our environmental standards. We're not staying true to our environmental laws. And truthfully, I don't think this board is doing its job of protecting the public and protecting our water quality. And I could not be more disappointed to hear that there probably be full allocations to farms this year, but that we are already cutting water quality standards during a time where it's raining and we're having a lot of storms. I think the board is probably aware, but I'm sure we'll have exact numbers sooner, that the numbers of salmon are so low in the Delta this year that all commercial fishing will likely be cut off, and this will also extremely impact the recreational industry. It'll extremely impact Native peoples and their ability to fish, and it'll extremely impact people all over the state that want to eat salmon. And then there's also the issues with not having enough water going in the Delta and what that's doing to our water quality. And I just want to say these are not just issues in the Delta. There are issues in the Scott and salmon. There are issues in the Scott and Shasta River. There are issues in the Eel River. There are issues in the Russian rivers. I feel like any watershed you look at, the fact is that we are always prioritizing the use of corporations and agriculture above the use of the public, and violating tribal trust and violating the public trust. And anyway, so I'll save the rest of my comments that are specific to the drought conditions for later, but I just wanted to make sure that the board is aware that when it comes to water allocations, there are no droughts. The farmers will be getting the water that they want. The only thing that's not getting water this year is the environment, and we are looking at an extinction crisis that is right around the corner. I'm sure you're aware that we've been violating environmental laws for 3-4 years now, at least. And that this is just the first year that we're dealing with those returns, and the returns are so incredibly dismal. It is hard to even express what it means to people who fish for a living or fish for their subsistence. So I just want to bring those issues up. You have the tools at your disposal. You have a racial equity resolution. You have the public trust. you have environmental laws, and we do not have to rely on voluntary agreements that will just get violated every single time the government asks anyway. I really want to encourage this board to please do your job to protect the public and protect water quality, and to just express that I could not be more disappointed after all my years of interacting with this board to just see that we're willing to keep acting like it's a drought for the sake of the environment and shortchanging the environment, but not for the sake of water allocations. And it's up to this board to move beyond those politics and decisions based on politics and actually protect water quality and the public, and to take a strong stance. And I really hope that you will change course for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chickazzola. I appreciate always your participation, everyone's participation, words, and sorry for your disappointment. I want to be clear that you look at the last 2 years and the work that this board has done in curtailing in the Scott, in the Shasta, curtailing and here administering water rights in a very difficult space, but more so than this board ever has in its history, and proud of the continued balance that I know we're having to be called to do, and appreciate, though, your advocacy as well. That's important to us here at the board. So just thanks. I appreciate your public comment. Next, I'd like to call up John Eric. Mr. Eric.
Thank you, Chairman Esqual. Board members, nobody ever wants to call me up to the front, but I appreciate that. I just want to give you a quick update. This is not a bad thing. I'm actually proposing good stuff here. So if we can do my PowerPoint real quick, it's just a real fast update on what we're trying to get done in the South Delta. So if you, next slide, please. There are two things we're trying to do. One of them is a Paradise Cut expansion project, which has to do with flood control. And the other one's a South Delta restoration, which, just to be frank with everybody, it's a dredging program plus a lot of habitat. So next slide, please. Again, I'm just trying to be real fast, but after the 97 flood, which all of you are too young to remember probably, but anyway, really bad conditions in the South Delta. We had a lot of flooding. So over time, various ideas came forth. The Paradise Cut expansion one is to build an additional bleed-off weir. So during high flows, the water will go on designated land, and then it'll slowly make its way back into Paradise Cut, which is the Central Valley Flood Control Project's bleed-off valve of the San Joaquin River. It doesn't take too much, but it does help. So the analysis, this is all preliminary, but the analysis shows that under 97 flood, we wouldn't have flooded. We would have had a 3-foot drop in stage at the river where the new weir would be, and a 2-foot drop at Mossdale, which is where I-5 crosses the river there. So really big benefits. However, that means the water goes somewhere else, not all at once, and so there's a limited but specific impact downstream where the water's being rerouted. So some of the downstream people, of course, were concerned about that. If we can have the next slide, please. When we first brought this topic up to everybody and tried to, see if people are on board, at the same time we started having this problem. And this is a picture I took at a diversion on an oxbow of Old River. And the guy called me, I think it was December, what was it, December something, it's on there. And he said, John, there's no water in Old River. And I said, well, there's water in Old River. And he says, no, there's no water, come out here. So I went out and took that picture, and that's the deep part of the channel over there on the upper right side, and it's only like 3 or 4 inches deep. So he couldn't irrigate. He lost his winter wheat crop. It was dry. He had to do irrigation. Anyway, it just keeps getting worse, and we thought that the high flows periodically flushed out the silt, but we must have reached a tipping point, and now the silt just keeps getting more and more and more in various areas. So these guys during the year, regular times of the year, can't divert. Next slide, please. This is the bridge on Middle River, Undine Bridge on Middle River, sorry. This is a sandbar that appeared last year in the drought on a channel that irrigates, 20,000 acres. And there are a number of diversions right there, 20 feet from that. There's some upstream, some downstream. Every year, unless it's a real wet, high flow year, even in the summer, every year the people along Middle River call me and say, John, there's no water, can't irrigate, so I, don't have a magic wand, so we try to do things and talk to the projects and see what we can do, if anything. But that just gives you an idea of the scope of the problem we're facing here. And it's not an overstatement to say that if this rate continues in another 5, years-ish, there will be areas that won't be able to irrigate in the South Delta. So if you can't irrigate, you can't farm, you can't develop the land because it's in the primary zone. So those guys will go out of business. That means there's less money for rec district assessments and everything else. It would affect my salary, but that's not why I'm here. But anyways, it's that big of a problem, so we got to do something. So we're proposing a dredging program which gets the downstream people from the Paradise Cut program on board. I say, if you can reestablish the channel capacities, we'll go along with that because we'll do other things. So the next slide, please. So we've already done, I'm sorry, that's the same channel. You can see that one's about 8 inches deep that's 200 yards down the other side there. Next slide, please. Sorry. So this is from a document produced by Anchor QA that was paid for by Central Delta, South Delta, and San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority. The state water contractors and the federal contractors have been part of this dredging process to investigate and come up with proposals. So we're ecstatic that we have the exporters, who are normally on the opposite side all the time. They agree with us that something has to be done. And that's because the channels of the South Delta are the mechanism by which water flows to the exports. It's the mechanism for fish, obviously. It's what makes the Delta work, or our part of the Delta. So outlined there in color, I don't have a pointer, and I don't mean to get too far afield here, but so we're hope to dredge substantial areas of Middle River and Old River. There are other things too, but those are the big ones that are silting up. Now, I don't want to take too much of your time, sorry, but when you have water conditions like I showed you in those pictures, that's not shallow water habitat for fish. And I've taken various fishery people out. I won't mention their names because they're not committed to anything. Taken them out there and I said, is this shallow water habitat? And they say, no. I said, well, wouldn't you like to have 8 feet of depth there, 6, whatever? And they say, yes. Now, there will be complaints. There will be people saying you're removing nutrients and biota and everything if you dredge. That's to some degree true. I'm not going to dispute that. But if you have deeper channels, you have colder water, you have more water flowing back and forth, so you improve the water quality. We'll remove all of the hyacinth, and they'll dredge out the Egeria, which nobody knows how to treat in the South Delta. And when it's deep, the Egeria doesn't come back as fast. I don't know if it'll be a cure forever. So in order to make this even better, just because we're good people and not the idiots everybody thinks we are, we have substantial habitat additions as part of the dredging program. There's a salmon slough there that's all clogged up with, blackberries, trees. It only flows when high water's coming down there, and then it makes eddies and ruins the levee there. It's got old meth labs in it probably. Turn that back into a real channel. We've got a couple islands we've identified to be habitat, whatever the fishery agencies want. What do you want? We'll make that anything you want. We'll have hundreds of thousands of tons, cubic feet of silt that we can use to put on the back sides of the levees for the downstream people, or they can trade it for rock, whatever they need. And of course, their projects need habitat mitigation too, so we're going to try to coordinate all of that. We've even got River Islands, which is Stewart Track. Sorry for throwing everything at you so fast. Downstream of Stewart Track on Paradise Cut, there are various interior Paradise Cut islands, I'll call them. In high flows, they're underwater. I've already talked to Susan Deloso, the head of River Islands. She says, yeah, you guys want to make some sort of habitat project on these pieces that we're not ever going to develop? Fine. So we've got these grandiose ideas, and I'm looking for everybody to support this because I want somebody else's money, not mine. So that's my long tirade. Thank you.
I really appreciate that, Mr. Eric. I know that there's been a lot of discussion around the issue of sedimentation in the South Delta. To your point, its impacts on flow and water quality. And so I appreciate you presenting this and continue to elevate it. Glad to continue to understand how we do our part in some of that discussion. Vice Chair.
Thanks for the update. It's exciting to see some creative ideas about how to pull this together. Could you give us a quick update on permitting? Because I know there are a number of agencies involved in this project.
The Paradise Cut expansion portion started first, and so it's gone through a number of analyses, and the next step would be beginning permitting. The dredging part is only gone through this initial analysis, and that will have to have more analysis before it starts that permitting process. Rather than, and I say this, it sounds funny and it's true, but I don't do projects. I would stumble all over. I couldn't get it done. So the area got together and convinced the San Joaquin Area Flood Control Association, SWRCB, the local San Joaquin County group. They're going to take over the project. So they're waiting on some money from DWR, graciously. A lot of people at DWR on board. There's another chunk of money in some budget thing, and right now I'm trying to course various elected officials, in legislatures to see if we can come up with funds to do this. So we're not there yet, but the next step for the Paradise Cut part is to start the permitting process. And if anybody wants a tour, we're taking a lot of people out there, and you want a tour, I'll show you the whole thing and kind of brag about what we think we can do for habitat. I mean, I think we can get fish back in the South Delta. Right now, there aren't any. Anyway, thank you. Sorry.
And don't be sorry in the least, and thank you, and I'll take you up on that tour, Mr. Eric, so thank you. Ms. Tyler, does that bring us to the end of our public forum speakers? I want to thank everyone for their comments during public forum and for addressing and coming to the board. Next, let's move on to our board agenda. We have an uncontested item. I still believe, or apologize, we have our board meeting minutes. And so we have consideration of our adoption of our February 7th board meeting minutes. Looking to board colleagues if there's any adjustments or a motion.
I'll make a motion.
Second.
Thank you. Ms. Tyler, can you please call a roll call vote?
Board Member Morgan?
Aye.
Board Member McGuire?
Aye.
Vice Chair Diadamo?
Aye.
And Chair Esquivel?
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you as well. Now that brings us to item number 2, which is our uncontested item. And still uncontested, Ms. Tyler? Thank you then. And unless any discussion, and just want to thank everyone for their good work on it. I know that this is a huge issue when it comes to being able to better use groundwater out in Southern California, whether it's stormwater capture or all these other projects. I know it really hinges on this work. So not to give it short shrift, but if it's uncontested, look to my fellow colleagues.
Move adoption of item 2.
I'll second.
Thank you. And Ms. Tyler, can you please call a roll call vote?
Vice Chair Diadamo?
Aye.
Board Member Morgan?
Aye.
Board Member McGuire?
Aye.
Chair Esquivel?
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you as well. That now brings us to our informational item, item number 3. And this is our drought update and current hydrologic conditions. And want to acknowledge Director Namath is going to be joining us here. We'll have a brief presentation from our folks. And just thank you, Director, for joining us in today's discussion. And Mr. Ekdahl, good to see you. We'll give you a moment to transition here.
Thank you, Chair Esquivel, members of the board. I'm joined by Diane Riddle, Assistant Deputy Director for the Division of Water Rights. Dan will be presenting on the TUCP in a couple of slides. I'll begin with a very quick hydro update and kind of overview of general drought conditions and curtailments, and then turn it over to Diane and Director Nemeth for a discussion on the TUCP. Let's go to the next slide, please. A brief overview. We'll do the hydrology. We'll go into the specific curtailment updates, and then we do have a few other division actions to highlight, and then we'll wrap up with questions and comments. Next slide, please. So real quick, hydrology. We've all seen these slides. Wasn't the main focus of today, so I'll run through it quickly. You can see we're at about 39.1 inches for the Northern Sierra Index, still above average, but over the last 4 weeks or so, we have had a significant slowdown in the amount of precipitation received, and we're actually trending back towards average for the Northern Sierra. Next slide, please. This is for the central part of the Sierra. We're at 35.2, again, still significantly above average for the time of the year, but again, a significant pause in the rate of accumulation of precipitation. Next slide, please. And Southern California, same kind of story. Above average for now, but a slowing trend in dry conditions over the last 4 weeks or so. Next slide, please. Snowpack-wise, we are still, again, above average, 113, 140, and 168% of average for the north, central, and south parts of the Sierra, respectively. But again, that big, long pause that you've seen really since about the middle of January. We are forecasting to get, thank you, forgot to get my name tag. We are forecasting some additional precipitation events over the next week or so that will add back to the snowpack. They aren't forecast to be tremendously wet. So while there will be snow accumulations and potentially at low elevations in a scenario that's unlike what we've seen throughout much of California the last couple of years, there's not a ton of water associated with them, actually. Next slide, please.
Yeah, and the system, it's a cold system coming down from the north as opposed to the sort of atmospheric river dumping of precipitation that comes up from the subtropics, right? So
Correct.
kind of-
Yep. The name of the storm in some circumstances is referred to as an inside slider because it actually slides down the coast. But let's see, reservoir conditions, you can see we are at average or above average for many of the reservoirs. You can see New Malone is still below average. Oroville is above average. Shasta is still below average, although better than where it was last year. Next slide, please. And potentially worth calling out Kachuma, which has spilled for the first time in, I think, over a decade, or at least in many years, 100% of capacity. Diamond Valley is about 60%. San Luis is about 75% of capacity.
I remember when when I joined the board in 2017, and we'd have our updates, and it was always, for all those years, it's always like Kachuma would just get missed, and it was still in drought for, never left the drought, and now, is our first to finally kind of pop out a bit.
Next slide, please. Term 91 is not in effect. You can see the delta is still in excess conditions. Next slide, please. And we'll jump into kind of a general curtailment update now. Again, we'll run through these pretty quickly. Conditions have been wet across much of the state, and so the Bay Delta curtailments are still suspended. We did rerun the analysis. There were some subwatersheds that did indicate that maybe some of the most junior rights were potentially in a curtailment stage, but when you look at the watershed scale, based on the methodology, they were not subject to curtailment. And so based on discretion, which is authorized in the executive order and related emergency regulations, there are no curtailments in place at this time, especially with the precipitation forecast this week. We do want to note that we have an upcoming staff workshop scheduled for March 10th to discuss possible changes to the water unavailability methodology, specifically looking at availability of water within the legal delta and how we calculate and refine return flows and how that contributes to water unavailability. That will be a virtual workshop, and I think the notice either has gone out or will go out shortly. And that the technical documents will be posted on the Delta Drought webpage in advance of that meeting. Next slide, please. Mill and Deer Creeks, no update here. The minimum in-stream flows have been met since the regulations went into effect in mid-October. Next slide, please. The Russian River, no curtailments for the month of February. We do want to know that the Voluntary Water Sharing Program, the steering committee, has prepared a retrospective and are discussing improvements for 2023 if necessary. Next slide, please. Just a quick graphic showing where things are in Lake Mendocino and just how things have changed. If you look at the green line, which I believe was the start of water year 2022, we were down close to 12,000 acre feet, I believe, in the reservoir, and that was kind of a guess because there haven't been some of the sediment studies to really show if there was truly 12,000 or so acre feet are left. And now we're close to 100,000 acre feet. It's about 115% of the flood curve for this time of year, and just completely different conditions in this watershed. Lake Sonoma is also in much, much better shape. I don't have a graphic for that one this time, but it's still in much better conditions. Next slide, please. Scott and Shasta Rivers, all curtailments are suspended for another week or so. In the Scott, we do a little shorter term duration in the Scott just because it tends to be a little flashier, so we'd go week by week. In the Shasta, curtailments are suspended, at least conditionally, through March 2023. And we do run the analyses again and provide updates as we need to. Just a note that the prohibition on inefficient livestock watering does remain in effect. Next slide, please. And a quick note on Mono Lake. We did have a workshop last week. It was attended by about 375 people online, which was a very robust attendance for a workshop. And just a note that we are accepting written comments through March 17th. And we'll be following up after that. Next slide, please. Additional information, our typical list of website links and email subscription lists. Just as a reminder, for updates, please sign up and you'll get notifications when we issue them. And next slide, please. I think with that, I'd like to turn it over to Diane and a discussion on the TUCP. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Again, I'm Diane Riddle. I'm one of the Assistant Deputy Directors for the Division of Water Rights. With me today is Dana Heinrich with our Office of Chief Counsel. Next slide, please. So before we get into the temporary urgency change petition, before the temporary urgency change petition was submitted, the governor did issue Executive Order N3-2, modifying prior executive orders related to drought conditions. Specifically, this executive order modified Directive 4 of the previous emergency proclamation with new text that allowed for or directed the State Water Board to consider modifying requirements for reservoir releases or diversion limitations of the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project in order to facilitate conservation of water upstream in reservoirs for later in the year and to protect cold water pools, to enhance in-stream flow conditions for fish, to improve water quality, to protect carryover storage, and to ensure minimum health, safety, and safety water supplies, as well as provide opportunities to maintain or expand water supplies north and south of the Delta. The order also requires monitoring and evaluation of any changes approved pursuant to this directive, and suspends requirements of Water Code Section 13247 and the Public Resources Code related to the California Environmental Quality Act. Following the executive order, on February 13th, the Department of Water next slide, please. Sorry about that. So following the executive order on February 13th, the Department of Water Resources and U.S. Bureau of Reclamation submitted a temporary urgency change petition to modify their water rate requirements included in Decision 1641. Specifically, the Department of Water Resources and Bureau of Reclamation requested elimination of a requirement to meet Port Chicago Delta outflow requirements included in Table 4 of D1641 during the months of February and March. This requirement is the highest Delta outflow requirement in Decision 1641. There are 3 ways to meet this requirement. There's a Delta outflow means of meeting the requirement through 3-day running average net Delta outflow index of 29,200 cubic feet per second. The requirement can also be met through a salinity level at the Port Chicago station, either a daily or a 14-day running average electrical conductivity level of 2.64 micromos per centimeter. This is commonly referred to as X2. The requirement requires a certain number of days of compliance at this location. The requirement is only triggered in wetter conditions. Based on the prior month's conditions, including the 8 River Index, as well as an additional trigger based on salinity conditions the 14 days prior to the effective period of the next month. This year, the unmodified Port Chicago requirement required 28 days of compliance at Port Chicago in February, and we don't quite know exactly what will be required in March, but it ranges from likely 9 to 20 days, depending on the hydrology in February. Next slide, please. So before approving a temporary urgency change petition, the board must make the following findings. The permittee or licensee has an urgent need to make the change. The proposed change may be made without injury to other lawful users of water. The proposed change may be made without unreasonable effects upon fish, wildlife, or other in-stream beneficial uses. And the proposed change is in the public interest. Next slide, please. So on February 21st, yesterday, the board issued an order conditionally approving the temporary urgency change petition. The order approves the changes to the Port Chicago requirement for the remainder of February and March and leaves in place the remaining Delta outflow requirements including requirements at Chips Island and Collinsville for maintaining delta outflow or salinity levels. The order requires that the modification of the requirement during March should not affect the requirement during April. Given the trigger that I referred to earlier, there could be some interaction there. The order specifies that that interaction should not change the applicability of any Port Chicago days during April. The order, with respect to the findings that I referred to earlier, the order finds that the petitioners have an urgent need for the change in order to improve water supplies. Modeling submitted with the TUCP identifies that exports would be increased by over 680,000 acre feet by not meeting the Port Chicago requirement in February and March. Maintaining normal project operations to meet delta outflow objectives would significantly reduce opportunities to export water, obviously making these supplies unavailable for the remainder of the season for water supply contractors. Reductions in surface water supplies could also place additional strain on already significantly depleted groundwater basins and on supplies needed from the Colorado River, and reducing supplies to some state water project contractors. In summary, in light of the severe magnitude of the drought over the last 3 years and the uncertain future hydrology, the order finds that there is an urgent need for the proposed changes. The order also finds that there will be no injury to other legal users of water, given the salinity conditions will be maintained for the protection of agricultural and municipal beneficial uses. The order does identify that the changes proposed in the TUCP have the potential to negatively impact native, resident, and migratory fish species. However, in accordance with the executive order, the order finds that the changes provide opportunities to maintain or expand water supplies to ensure water supplies for the purposes of drought resilience. In addition, the State Water Board consulted with the Department of Fish and Wildlife regarding the changes, and the Department of Fish and Wildlife concurred that the changes would not have any more than incremental effects. Subsequently, the Department of Fish and Wildlife also submitted a letter indicating that they are currently processing a request for an amendment to DWR's incidental take permit to incorporate the changes from the TUCP. And to date, they have not found that there would be any substantial impacts to fish and wildlife. Next slide, please. The order includes a number of conditions in order to help to make the findings in the order. The order requires consultation on real-time operations with the State Water Board and federal and state fishery agencies. The order requires monitoring, modeling, and other evaluations of the effects of the changes on native fish species, including an evaluation of the effects compared to without the changes on entrainment-related effects. The order requires maintenance and quality control of salinity data from the monitoring locations required in Decision 1641. The order also requires accounting of the changes, including the benefits to exports and reservoir storage, the changes to delta outflow, and related conditions resulting from the temporary agency change petition. The order also includes a requirement for an evaluation of opportunities to use a portion of the water supplies resulting from the change for environmental purposes. The order also requires compliance with the interim operations plan submitted to the court by DWR and Reclamation, as well as, so this order has not yet been acted upon by the court, so the order requires compliance with the submitted interim operations plan until the court acts upon the submittal to the court, and upon the court action, the order requires compliance with that court order. The order also requires compliance with the Sacramento Temperature Management Plan as approved by the Executive Director. We have not yet received that Sacramento River Temperature Management Plan. We should receive that later in the spring. Upon receipt of that Temperature Management Plan, the order would require compliance with the approved plan by the Executive Director. And lastly, the order includes continuing authority to modify the order based on comments, objections, or changed conditions. Next slide, please. So in accordance with the provisions of the Water Code related to temporary urgency change petitions, the board is authorized to issue an order in advance of the close of the public comment period. We did that yesterday. The public comment period will close on February 23rd. The petition was noticed on February 14th. We have received several comments to date. We are reviewing those comments and we'll be considering them and providing them to the board members. And those comments may result in additional changes to the order or further direction to DWR and reclamation related to the order. That completes my summary of the temporary urgency change petition. The order, I can turn it over to Carla Namath with the Department of Water Resources for some additional remarks.
Thank you, Ms. Riddle.
Thank you, Diane. And good morning, Chair Esquivel and members of the board. I appreciate the ability to join you here today, if only virtually. I do have a handful of slides, and I think Water Board staff will load them. And while that's happening, I want to maybe open by saying that where we are in California with coincidental drought and flood emergencies is really new ground. And I do want to reflect on the work that the department has done over the course of the last 3 years with the Water Board around these temporary urgency change petitions and our, I think, mutual desire to do them if they're needed, to signal that they're needed early so that we can provide more of an opportunity for public input and comment and public process, given how complex conditions are and how complex our water systems are in California. And I want to start by acknowledging that this particular petition did not follow that practice. And it is still our goal as a department to be able to do that. And, I believe that this is just yet another set of circumstances, just moving from extreme dry to extreme wet back to extreme dry, that really challenges the ways in which we manage our system and the ways in which we do so as nimbly as we can, but ways that are very important relative to flexibility, to meeting all the needs that the projects need to meet, including those of the environment. So I did want to start by acknowledging that and committing to continue to improve our ability to provide that kind of advanced planning, if you will, and public process. So with that, I just really do have a handful of slides here. This opening slide shows conditions up at Oroville. As you can see, that top slide is the result of our January storms. It's really an astonishing improvement over where we had been. So that's our before and after. Next slide, please. However, when we look at where we are more broadly in the water year, the department calls this building a water year. And what you're seeing here is the real enormity of the storms that came in January. We did have wet conditions earlier in the season, November and December. which very much saturated the soils, and then the following 9 atmospheric rivers that made up the first 2 weeks of January. Given the soil saturation, it resulted in significant flooding in portions of the state. As those atmospheric rivers tailed off, as Mr. Ekdahl mentioned, we entered into a dry period. It has been extraordinarily dry, as based on what would be typical for February, since the atmospheric rivers tailed off in that 3rd week in January. So over that, essentially the last 4-week period, 3 to 4 week period, we've had less than an inch of precipitation statewide. Our snowpack, our statewide snowpack, has moved from 205% of average on February 1st to 139% of average in a span of 20 days. So that very much gives you a sense of how big these extremes are and the immediate signs that we see in the Sierra snowpack. We do have a storm coming in this weekend, which is good news. But again, as Mr. Ekdahl mentioned, one, it's great that it is cold because it helps to preserve the snowpack. But what that also means, and what this storm is also looking like, is very light snow with limited water content. Again, you know, there's real value in it to preserving our existing snowpack, even building on that existing snowpack, but that snow water content is really what helps us understand where we're going to be relative to snowpack runoff into river streams and reservoirs that then gets managed throughout the spring and summer. We don't really know what's in store for March, April, and May. And so we've got continued uncertainty, a good start to this year, but continued uncertainty with the hydrology and continued uncertainty as to how that runoff will appear deeper into the season. Next slide, please. So as Ms. Riddle mentioned, the department with reclamation did pursue a temporary urgency change petition. This was aimed at addressing the fact that February did turn dry. And as you are well aware, the request from the department was to, after that very wet January, which triggered Port Chicago salinity standard, followed by that dry February. What we're essentially doing from a water year perspective, and I want to just put a little asterisk on that, we're essentially looking to manage the system during this February period and potentially during March if additional storms don't generate inflow into the Delta. We are essentially have petitioned the board to think about this water quality, one particular water quality standard, as if it were an average year. And that essentially requires compliance at Chips Island. That does put the salinity standard really smack dab in the middle of the Sassoon Bay, which does continue to provide benefit for species. As a general matter, the value of this change petition is ultimately to conserve storage that we have in Oroville. We are continuing to monitor conditions down at the pumps where all measures remain in full effect, consistent with our California Endangered Species Act coverage. And of course, as Ms. Riddle mentioned, a condition of the order is to implement the submitted interim operations plan, which helps us ensure alignment with the Bureau of Reclamation. Next slide, please. I do want to say a little bit about the department's thinking around species protection. A few key points that I want to make, in addition to those made by Ms. Riddle, which require significant real-time coordination with the water board. One is that part of the dynamic that we're seeing in the system is that the very intense increases during the month of January did produce benefits that are favorable conditions for listed species. Both delta smelt and longfin smelt distributions were outside the hydrodynamic footprint of the projects. We have not salvaged any winter run salmon to date at the projects. And as I mentioned, under the TUCP, the low salinity zone will remain centered in Sassoon Bay. One of the things that we are very focused on is continuing with our reduced entrainment risk based on real-time data, and that is assessed by multi-agency technical teams each week to determine appropriate old and middle river actions. So that is the place of very intense focus during this proposed period to make sure that we are not harming species. This also does not create any impacts on our summer to fall habitat actions, which will very much continue to be important as the season progresses. One of the things I want to point out is the storage gained under these provisions does provide important additional flexibility for fish protections in the spring. One of the things that the department is looking into is the potential for Feather River pulse flows to enhance spring run juvenile survival during March and April. And our ability to maintain that storage in Oroville helps us have that flexibility. I also, really want to comment on where we've been these last 2 years. Water year in 2021 was a painful water year in which the project understood too late what was happening to snowpack. And it created, I think, a cascade of decisions that nobody wants to repeat. The department certainly does not want to repeat those kinds of conditions where we had TUCPs moving throughout the summer. Even with those TUCPs in place, given the warm temperatures, it was very difficult to continue to meet those outflows, in part because of releases from Oroville at their sort of generally understood modeled volumes. We're not making it all the way to the Delta. And there were multiple things that were affecting that. Overall ambient temperatures, dry conditions, also other diversions coming out of the system between, below the dam and down to the Delta. That was not a situation that we care to repeat in any sense. The subsequent year, 2022, I think was a real improvement on that, both with our carryover storage at the beginning of the year, really signaling very early what was happening with the potential for TUCPs. We had submitted one early in that season. We pulled it back after some storms in December, but then shortly thereafter, a couple months later into the season, we were back in that TUCP zone for the springtime. What was important in that scenario was last year for the back half of that season, we did not need any additional TUCPs to help manage our system. So all of that to say, what we're looking at today is continuing hydrologic uncertainty. It is still early in the season. It is still, as Mr. Ekdahl mentioned, it is still possible that we will have an average year up in the Sacramento Valley and the 8-station index side of our system. We are looking at the deep challenges along the Trinity with that reservoir system, and the fact that that reservoir system is co-operated with Shasta, and that entire part of California remains in severe drought.
Apologies, it looks like we lost Director Namath here. We'll give her a moment to come back on. It looks like her internet connection cut out, regrettably. We'll give her just a quick moment, and maybe as we then wait for her to rejoin, I just want to say, I know that the conditions, as the director had said, are incredibly dynamic. The job of balancing amongst this, especially given the uncertainties going into not just what the summer may hold, but what next year may hold as well, aren't easy. I know that for myself and for all the members on this board, and I don't speak for everyone lightly, but we take very seriously the job of balancing. And it is not just this inter-year variability that we've never necessarily seen before, but also how we are going to manage our projects in year over year that really come to mind and frame what is this action and or request, again, backdropped against that uncertainty within the year itself, let alone what we may be finding next winter, which again we want to be able to try to move, if we can, water when we can best balance these issues. And as the director was saying, lay off, if you will, of those relaxations in other times, the summer and here now, continuing to go out into the future. So it isn't an easy system. I know it's dynamic. It doesn't look like Director Namath is joining us here right away. I know she will be able, I'm sure, to come back on and allow her to finish her points. But I look over to board colleagues. I know we don't have the director with us now, so any comments you might like to make, and then any questions, let's reserve them for when you can hear them coming back onto the platform. Vice Chair?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, it's too bad Director Nemes isn't here at this point, but I do appreciate her acknowledgement that this wasn't ideal coming in as committed to provide as much advance warning and dialogue with our staff as possible. So I do appreciate that. And I'll just flag, and I'll restate it when it comes to questions, but want to give our staff an opportunity to respond to this or, kind of rethink it when Director Nemeth comes back. But for me, I think it would be helpful if we had a little more information about the Port of Chicago standard and that 30-day period or whatever the exact period is and the purpose behind it. Also, I'd be curious to learn more about how things have been modeled, in the past. Looking back, that time frame was put into D1641 because it was, I believe, indicative of the year type. And so what we're seeing here is that what started out to be a really wet year and ends up now, as was discussed, kind of teetering around potentially normal. And so maybe just spending a few moments on, reminding us all about that requirement and what went into the thinking when it was adopted many years ago, before we saw sort of this climate whiplash that we're experiencing.
I appreciate that, Vice Chair. And it might be helpful to just also understand what years previously Port Chicago had been triggered and kind of what did those years look like. So as we kind of understand, again, what do these circumstances look like vis-a-vis some of that work? But
I don't know if you can see me.
we can. Director Namath. Thank you. Apologies.
I apologize.
Oh,
I'm now
okay.
joining via telephone, so I apologize for that disruption.
It's okay, and thank you. We were just filling the time a little, and here we can continue on with your presentation if you'd like.
Sure. I just have a couple more slides. So next slide. So you all have seen this. I won't belabor it. Really, storage rebounding in certain parts of California. We're above average in Oroville, but also below average in Shasta, and then I mentioned along the Trinity there. Next slide, please. So this is another way in which we look at drought. And you can see along the left side column there, our snowpack is one indicator of where we are relative to drought. Surface water reservoirs are another, and then groundwater is yet another. And this is, I think, more toward the broader discussion about are we out of drought? And the answer is no. We do have tremendous snowpack. We can see that that is above average. We can see that statewide reservoir storage is almost at average, but we can see the tremendous deficits that that we have and continue to have in our groundwater basins. It's really the totality of those things that make up our drought conditions. Next slide, please. So that's all I had. Again, I apologize for the disruption there, and I am certainly glad to engage in any of the board members' concerns or comments. I did want to just say I caught the tail end of board member D'Adamo's comments about water year type, and I agree that that is just becoming increasingly challenging, and water year types are the underpinning of a lot of decisions that we make. And I would observe that as that remains the underpinning of those decisions, it doesn't, it's working less and less well for both the environment and for people. Because I think collectively, we know we have to do much better planning so that we can survive these kinds of weather systems that move in ways that make the system work for all the beneficial uses that we need. So thank you.
Thank you, Director. And no worry about the technical glitch. It's just part of modern living at this point. And I think I was saying, as you had dropped off there, and I think important for me is the continued thought about how we balance the system. And certainly there's balancing as this decision and the TUCP now is before us, but I think it's also, and you made comment to this, how, writ large, the system we're managing is going to be more protective into the future and is starting to incorporate some of these lessons that we're obviously all learning real time. Some of that, and I appreciate, is around process. I think that, the nature of a temporary and urgency change petition is sometimes that they are urgent and hard to see, but I think that, these last 2 years particularly, we've moved to a lot more of a real-time understanding of what's happening across the system. We've seen what curtailments as well look like as we, manage what are, again, these increasing pressures that we'll see from whether it's ET and the demands that that has, or just, again, how we actually administer water rights or accomplish all the balancing and the support of the many beneficial uses that go on to support a state this large, an economy this large, a population this large. And so just thanks. I appreciate what will be, I know, continued discussion around not just, this decision before the board, but how writ large we continue to really handle the realities of what this century and what this changed climate we're all within mean. And again, I think of the work that we're having to do inter-year and then across year over year. And I think that there's some common themes around pulling less from the system when it's most stressed and beginning to pivot to when there are opportunities to move a little more water, but that's so that we can be more protective in those more critical times that we know just are really hampering our watersheds in many ways. So thank you. I appreciate the points here, and I know the discussion we have and the Vice Chair's question around, helping us by understanding when this, say, the water year type challenges that we're having and when this requirement was last triggered, better understanding what years those were and what things look like and how, and helping us understand through that balance how we really are outside of what are otherwise hydrologic norms that were set here a long while ago and not reflective of this changed climate that we have. And this isn't easy. The work of balancing here, because of the status of the species, because of the longstanding conflicts around how we're going to manage the system, And I think that these are opportunities that we do better through it. So I appreciate the conditions that are also that have been incorporated at this point that help us to make sure we're better figuring out that system in tandem with our biological agencies and with the expertise of all the technical staff that we have. Thank you. I look to other colleagues. Is there anything further, Vice Chair, now that Director Namath is here with us?
Yes. So, Director Namath, my question specifically, did talk about the year type and how my question was really focused on D1641, the Port of Chicago requirement, and any information that might be available. And I had posed this to our staff as well with respect to modeling in prior years, because this year just it just seems that standard in the past we could rely on the prior 30 days as really telling us something about the water year type. And now what we're seeing is maybe it initially told us something that turns out not to be the case. And so just trying to put it, number one, for us to become better educated about the standard itself, and then any information on modeling that could help us put this in greater context.
Well, I will say, Vice Chair, the last time this was triggered was in 2017, and it rained in a historic way throughout February and later into the season. That was a year where the State Water Project moved more water than it had previously, but the standard was largely met. I mean, there's just so much water in the system because it started to rain and it kept raining. We had a much warmer series of storms that moved through. We learned from that. So that 2017 was a drought busting year. And one of the things the department learned from that experience was we also had to do better with carryover in Oroville. And so in 2020, right before this drought set in, 2020 was actually our first year of operating with additional carryover in Oroville Reservoir. And we increased carryover by 20%. And the point of that was to enable us to use the reservoir kind of more proactively to be ready to meet, the basic needs of our system. Not just water supply, but the needs that we have for Oroville to help maintain, obviously, flows in the Feather River, but also do its part to help maintain outflow in the Delta. Now, I would observe in 2020, we had a 5% allocation that year. And I think frankly, that which is really a health and safety kind of allocation. We were fortunate that was frankly the first year of the drought. So a lot of our water users had stored water supplies. However, I would note if we had not had that carryover storage in place, that year would have been a lot worse for all of us. And so we are in fact learning as we go. We did learn from the previous drought, the importance of carryover storage in Oroville. I think the real challenge with this drought, as we've all talked about, is the signature is the moving from extreme dry to extreme wet and then back to extreme dry.
Thank you. And I think Ms. Riddle, did you have a response?
Yes, with respect to the trigger is based on the prior month's 8 river index. It's not really a water year type issue. I believe the standard was developed in order to provide some certainty to reservoir operators. That can have the side effect of not having something that triggers from prior wetter conditions applying in the next month. And I think that's what you've had here. I do think historically, frequently, this requirement has been met incidentally. It didn't require major modifications to operations as occurred this year, but I think there are trade-offs in terms of how you develop a standard and considerations related to storage, and so it does get to complicated with respect to that issue. With respect to the purpose for the standard is based on relationships between estuarine species abundance that have persisted over the long term and delta outflow levels. These particular delta outflow levels are the higher delta outflow levels identified in the Bay Delta Plan and Decision 1641 and are really intended to aid in the recovery and sustaining native species. They're not as we have been talking about with prior TUCPs, the bare minimum belly scraping flows these are the flows that are intended to provide for some recovery. That being said, do we really understand, given the relationship between these outflow levels and the species abundance levels, these are relationships that have been established over time. It's unclear exactly what effect these changes over 1 or 2 months will have in the longer term, but there is a different context to this set of changes than we've had for other temporary urgency change petition actions. So I did want to point that out.
Thank you, Ms. Riddle. And thank you, Director Namath. Looking to other board colleagues with questions and comment. Board Member McGuire.
Yes, good morning, and thank you for the presentation and the update on the current conditions and the need for the temporary urgency change petition. I certainly understand the desire and the need to preserve water supplies, and I think back often to last year and the incredibly great December that we had, followed by the 3 months of zero precipitation and snow, and I reflect on that, and I'm thinking about that here in this context, that we certainly it's looking to be a little bit different than last year, but nonetheless we've learned a lot about how erratic our system and our hydrology can be. But what's also weighing on me is that our fish and wildlife feel the same erratic nature of our hydrology. And it's been compounding for them as well for the past few years with the drought. And so that's something that has resonated with me deeply. And I'm thinking about that in the context of D1641 and the Bay Delta Plan, to your point, Chair Esquivel, about balancing resources, about balancing human needs for agriculture, for urban uses, with reasonable protection of fish and wildlife, and how we can ensure that we're making those decisions with as much information as possible. So, questions about the standards, the Port Chicago, why the standards exist, and the sort of dynamic nature of the ESA requirements that we're dealing with here as well, make it difficult in my mind to figure out how do we in that space deal with the expectations of D1641 and what they lay out before us. Because as I look at it, Endangered Species Act, as I've always understood it, is more of a single species approach to managing conditions in the Bay Delta for those species, whereas the Bay Delta Plan itself is broader in scope. It looks at reasonable protection of fish and wildlife. It encompasses a much broader scope of needs, and so that is something that I keep in mind as I'm weighing decisions and thinking about how do we proceed forward into the future, knowing that it's unknown, knowing that at any point in any year, this is California, this is climate change, this is the hydrology that we're dealing with, it's always going to be uncertain. And so I'm encouraged to hear that we're doing a lot of work to better understand, better forecast, better prepare for these types of situations, but I do have a couple of questions, and one is how, I keep hearing about, I hear that the report today was about the snowpack and that it's gone down, that we were over 200% and now it's 140%, or depending on the watershed, which is not the direction we want to be going in right now, but at the same time, there's a lot of snow in the Sierras, as I understand it. So Director Namath or staff, I don't know who can answer this question best, but how are we looking at the upcoming months here for the spring? You know, we're making this decision in part to preserve carryover storage, but I think there's a lot of storage still in the snowpack. So how are we, or do we have a good understanding of how that will translate into greater runoff into the reservoirs here in the spring?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the department has a goal. As I said, you know, we want to be at 1.6 million acre feet in Oroville, and we have a goal this year to hit that carryover, even if this year develops as a 99% exceedance. That's our goal. And we're doing everything we can to meet it. And I think that this TUCP helps that, because what we're looking at doing is, you know, we've got the next few months, but we've also got, you know, the potential for dry conditions to return next year. And we want to be out of this dynamic that we've been in the last couple of years, where we're certainly 2021 was something we never wanted to beat at Oroville, and then we had better conditions last year. And just operationally, that's what we're kind of looking to dig out. So that is very much on my mind, and that is you know, one of our goals. I say the department is, we do have a 30% allocation to our workers. We expect to adjust that. That in all likelihood, you know, come out later today. We adjusted very modest way, owing to these uncertain conditions and owing to where we want to be in September with this, you know, 1.6 million acre foot carryover. So those are kind of the bones, if you will, of what we're thinking about relative to managing more cautiously. I would say year over, better enable us to accommodate these extreme swings that we're experiencing, and then I make mention of forecasting improvements. One, we've had a lot of discussion in the public about forecasting of atmospheric rivers and how much that really helped us on the flood side to understand, you know, when and where those systems were coming. Our systems, when they start running during the high water event, those are very dynamic situations where we adjust as that flow is coming in. We're dynamic on the flood front, if you will, on the front end of those situations where we have really hard and fast rules that are very baked in. This is where all forecast informed reservoir operation is really, you know, gaining traction. Not a silver bullet, but it will be a helpful tool, you know, married with the atmospheric river research that we're doing. There are a couple other very helpful tools that are also available to us. One is not that new. It's the airborne snow observation, and I think you've heard me talk about it before. So we've been flying flights already this year in an expanded way. We had money in the budget from the governor and legislature to do that. That's going to help us get a much better read on what's in that snowpack and what the snow water content is of that snowpack. We had 200 sensors, you know, up and down the Sierra, but they only go so far upslope. One of the signatures of probably not this storm coming in, but the January storms, and part of why the snowpack in the central and southern Sierra was so much more than what occurred in the northern Sierra was higher altitude. You know, we get colder and we get more snow. So our ability to measure that up to the Sierra Peak is going to be important new information that is incorporated into our runoff forecast. That's our Bulletin 120. We've had one come out so far this year, so we'll see what happens after this next series of storms and what happens there. The last thing I want to mention is there's other work underway that's really important at incorporating overall temperature impacts on soil conditions, but also evaporation, and some of these dynamics that we experience with snowmelt and when the peak actually comes. Obviously, especially in wildfire areas, we have challenges with canopy, and that as the days get longer through the season, it creates more sunlight, which creates additional snowmelt in ways that haven't particularly been captured in the way that we model and forecast conditions. So that is some work that I'd be glad to come back and talk to the board about in much more detail. Our state climatologist, Dr. Anderson, is in the lead. That's work that is going to be, 2 to 3 years, include peer review, very intense work with our partners in academia and in the federal government on that kind of regionalizing some of the climate science and getting that into our models so that we have, even if we have these extreme events, we have greater predictive skills that enable us to manage the resource better.
I did want to add in a few things, if I may. One point of clarification is just that the snowpack isn't actually decreasing; it's where it is relative to average. So back in January, there's just usually, on average, less snow in January, and so we had this huge, tremendous snowpack, and you've seen this long, quiet period. So now average is kind of catching up to where we were. Another thing to consider is that I think it's human nature. We look at these numbers, 140% of average, and you think that's so much. But if you kind of look at it a slightly different way, well, 40% above average, it's good. It's not fantastic. You look at precipitation, 27% above average. Again, it's good, especially after 3 years of drought, but it isn't kind of like it was back in the middle of when we were having atmospheric river after atmospheric river. And so slowly over time, those numbers are kind of catching up to the long-term average. Another thing to consider, and I'm stealing this factoid or metric from Julie Rosardo, one of our other assistant deputy directors. We were discussing kind of trends and planning out what our workload and priorities were going to be for the remainder of the winter if it kept wet. But she noted that snowpack on average is about 30% of the statewide water supply, and there's a lot of variability to that, and it changes and it depends where you are geographically. But 140% of 30%. It's good, it's great, but it's not the big chunk of water. There's still a lot of reliance on precipitation, especially if you go into these other watersheds like the Klamath, the Eel, that still rely very much on just rain precipitation. And so we're not out of the drought yet, and we are in this kind of dichotomy of both drought and flood at the same time. The other thing I think that weighs in the back of our head, and it's outside the division's purview clearly, but it's a flood issue. And we have this tremendous snowpack, but we've also seen historically, if you go back to 1997, the thing that triggered the big floods in the Central Valley was a rain on snow event, a Pineapple Express, where you had a very warm snow system that fell on this tremendous snowpack and resulted in very excessive floods and an immense amount of damage very quickly. I think, fortunately, the reservoirs are in such a condition right now that they can catch a lot of that if it were to occur. But again, depends on timing and what things look like for the rest of the year.
I appreciate those responses for both of you, and I, for one, would welcome some additional conversations as we move forward here with how we can take that good information and the investments we're making in better forecasting and apply those to our processes going forward. As everyone knows, we're in the process right now of updating the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan, and climate change is a big question mark, in that plan in terms of how it influences upcoming management decisions. And so that's just an area that I've always been interested in and would just like to better understand how these tools can help inform that process. And so my last question is kind of relates to the shorter term. And I feel like, Director Nemeth, I appreciate your commitment to work on the process in terms of timing of TUCPs, and I appreciate that this was a little bit of a unique instance here, and there have been a number of TUCPs over the past few years, and those have followed a different timeline, so I appreciate that. Just wondering if, given, the forecasting, the tools that you're and the information that we have before us today, if you anticipate or have any information to describe if there's triggers or other ways that we would have any, advance notice of any additional TUCPs that might be required this year.
No, we're not seeking additional TUCPs this year.
Thank you.
Thank you, board member, and thank you, director. Anything further from, we have commenters, and I think, I did want to acknowledge and thank the board member's comment, board member McGuire, for your comments. I think we know there's an interplay between Porter Cologne, D1641, ESA, and the last, and important why we are updating our water quality control plan update. We had a recent informational item where we laid out our timeline these next 2 years. And it's obvious that since the last update of the water quality control plan update, the ESA has come in and created what is a lot more of the action around some of these protections, but there is an important interplay between them. We have to understand them. And importantly, Porter Cologne is a broader authority. It isn't a single species approach. But I think that the policy landscape is certainly, and legal otherwise, are complicated, aren't easy, but we have opportunities here to unpack them, make sure that we're best balancing this system moving forward. And again, just appreciate the comments that you made around the way that these issues should be seen and or stacked, and the way that we can really help by using different authorities to get to the outcomes that we're really looking to see in our watersheds. And just appreciate that. I want to note as well that I know as we had indicated, a decision on the TUCP, it was adopted even though public comment is still open. So we're still receiving objections from folks. We're still reviewing those. And additionally, should the decision be petitioned, there'll be additional public process. So I want to point to those as ways of, for those that are commenting, are part of our process here, that it's still ongoing. So appreciate that. Let's go ahead and anything further for Director Namath? And I know, Director, you have a lot going on, so I appreciate, and I know this one of them, and appreciate you being here, part of the forum and discussion around how best we're understanding the requests, the balancing that we're trying to do, and the opportunity to continue to do better by the system. So really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate that.
Thank you. Let's move on to our commenters. And I want to first call up Doug Obigi, who will be followed by Aaron Woolley, Kaya Rivers, and then Regina Chicazola. And I believe those are the 4 commenters we have for the item. Good morning. Good to see you, Mr. Obigi.
Good morning, Chair Esquivel, members of the board. My name is Doug Obigi. I'm a senior attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council. I want to thank you for giving me a little bit of extra time to talk today. I'm kind of at a loss for what to say. I've been doing this for 15 years, and I'm really struggling to see what value there is in me speaking to the water board. If the board's just simply going to rubber stamp breaking the rules and never actually implement updated rules, what are we doing here? Fundamentally, the grounds for approval of the TUCP were not met in this instance, and the board should have denied it. Well, I understand there's a lot of political pressure to do so, and it puts you all in a really awkward and terrible position. And fundamentally, that is a failure of leadership far above you. But it is also each of our roles to determine at what point things have gone too far and we have to act, even if it comes at a real cost to our personal careers and requires us to sacrifice, something that you have to deal with much more than I do. Approval of the order does have unreasonable impacts on fish and wildlife. The TUCP completely ignores the board's repeated findings that the existing standards are inadequate and do not provide balance in terms of providing reasonable protection for fish and wildlife. The board has repeatedly found that increased delta outflow in the winter and spring months is needed to provide reasonable protection of fish and wildlife. And cutting delta outflow is yet another example of the death by 1,000 cuts. That is why our fish and wildlife are going extinct and our salmon fisheries at real risk. Reducing delta outflow has an insidious but invisible effect on the abundance of our native fish and wildlife, no less than dumping toxic pollution into the bay and delta. Those fish don't show up dead at the pumps. They simply never exist because of the reduced outflow. Fundamentally, it's not just the water board's problem. There's been a real lack of leadership at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, which has failed to protect our fish and wildlife. And that's why we have so many endangered species in this state. The department has waived the requirements of the CESA permit for the State Water Project each of the last 3 years, every year since it's been issued. The one thing I can say is that I appreciate Director Bonham signing that subsequent letter to the Water Board rather than making his staff sign that and undermine their personal integrity, which is like what Chris Oliver did when he signed the Trump administration's biological opinions for the Delta rather than making the civil servants sign it. The TUCP is also not in the public interest. Contrary to some of the claims that you've heard today and claims in the documents, the modeling that's provided on the board's webpage shows that it does not improve reservoir storage. Oroville storage is the same at the end of September with and without the TUCP. Shasta storage is the same. The only thing that changes is the amount of water that's exported from the Delta. The TUCP is simply stealing water from the environment to give to the contractors. As your staff noted, the snowpack has not declined over time. The end of the April 1st average has actually increased compared to earlier in the year. And Reclamation just announced their allocations for the contractors, 100% for the settlement and exchange contractors, 100% for frying class 1, 35% for South of Delta Ag. DWR likewise has 100% allocation for their Feather River settlement contractors and is a 30+% allocation for their State Water Project contractors. All of the uncertainty that is claimed about hydrology is being borne by the environment, and none of it is being borne by the contractors. We're simply reallocating water to the contractors. And the board has repeatedly found that the existing rules are not balanced, that they fail to protect fish and wildlife, and that in order to achieve balance, the board's known for years that we have to substantially reduce water diversions from the Delta. Yet every time push comes to shove, the board agrees to waive the rules, not just now in the critically dry years, but waiving the rules in the average years. How much water supply is necessary for DWR to agree to comply with the environmental rules? And finally, DWR Reclamation clearly have failed to exercise due diligence. DWR announced in late January they wouldn't need TUCPs this year, and yet turned around and filed a TUCP after they violated the standard, not before. They've never petitioned to change the standard permanently, just instead relying on TUCPs to waive the rules. And in fact, rather than changing D1641, their VA proposal claims that it would provide outflow that's additional to the requirements of Decision 1641, that it would meet the Port Chicago standard in the future. I guess I missed the meeting where DWR announced a secret handshake to know which promises are the ones they're going to keep and which ones aren't worth the paper they're written on. This is not simply a failure to exercise due diligence. This is acting in bad faith. The board ultimately has lost a lot of credibility amongst the environmental community as a regulator. And it seems clear, as in the 1990s, that EPA is going to have to take over and set federal standards because the Newsom administration fails to do so. You are all supposed to be members of an independent board that does not just simply follow orders from the governor, but exercises your own independent judgment. And I guess the question for all of you is if you really think this is balanced. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. OBG. I appreciate your contributions and part of this discussion, being part of this discussion, truly. Thank you, Mr. OBG. Next, I'd like to call up Aaron Woolley, and will be followed by Kaya Rivers, and then Regina Chicazola.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to comment. My name is Aaron Woolley. I'm a policy advocate with Sierra Club California. It's disappointing that the board has again approved a TUCP for the Bay Delta. Native fish and wildlife have already suffered from multiple consecutive years of high temperatures, low in-stream flows, and TUCPs. California has experienced high precipitation in December and January this year, and there are flows available to help species make some improvement after multiple years of losses. So it's really disappointing to see these flows again cut to increase deliveries by the State Water Project and CVP contractors. In the last 9 years, DWR has pursued TUCPs in over half of them. These orders are no longer temporary. They're regularly a part of DWR's strategy for operating the State Water Project. And they're not just being pursued during extreme drought conditions, but in anticipation of some future drought. This is not the kind of advanced planning that DWR should be doing in light of aridification and climate change. It is a waiver of their obligation to plan for these changing scenarios. The thousands of acre feet in potential water supply savings under this order would not be reserved for human health and safety or for fish and wildlife, but delivered to the water contractors. The order anticipates that DWR and the Bureau of Reclamation will announce increases in deliveries to water contractors, and they have in response to this order. Prior TUCPs have been approved under the condition that these deliveries are only for human health and safeties. This order doesn't contain that limitation and is an increase in water deliveries with the acknowledgement that it'll have negative impacts on fish and wildlife. Respectfully, that's not balanced. It is a rewriting of water quality protections for fish and wildlife because they're inconvenient for diverters. The governor's executive order was not a mandate to this board, and I urge you to reconsider this order and to enforce your existing protections for fish and wildlife under the Bay Delta Plan. This TUCP is unreasonable, it's not in the public interest, and approving this violation of water quality standards will have consequences long-term for fish and wildlife in the Delta. Thank you, and appreciate your consideration of my comments.
Thank you very much for your participation and comments, Ms. Woolley. Really appreciate your time today. Thank you. Next, I'd like to call Kaya Rivers, who will be followed by Regina Chicazola.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Thank you, board, for the opportunity to provide comments today, and thank you for a very informative drought update. My name is Kaya Rivers. I'm a policy advocate at Community Water Center, highlighting the need to protect small disadvantaged communities' access to drinking water. Within the last 30 days, at least 23 wells have gone dry across the state, and this number is only expected to grow throughout the year. And as the number of dry wells increase, comprehensive drought planning is needed in order to prepare for and reduce future drought impacts. We appreciate that the State Water Board is joining efforts with DWR in promoting drought preparation by engaging the SB 552. More specifically, it is great to see that the State Water Board is enforcing the SB 552 requirement that small water suppliers' water shortage contingency plans must be available to the public and at the request of the State Water Board by July 1st of this year. Additionally, as the Department of Water Resources potentially determines the critically overdrafted sub-basins, groundwater sustainability plans as incomplete, and they're put into probation under the State Water Board's oversight, we ask that the State Water Board encourage that GSAs use this information provided by the small water suppliers' water shortage contingency plans. This information can notify GSAs where domestic wells are being impacted by declining groundwater levels, and in turn inform how they should make changes to their groundwater management efforts. Furthermore, under SB 552, counties should have created a county drought task force by January of last year. Counties across the state still do not have these task forces created, which is especially concerning considering that some of these counties are located in areas where residents are at high risk of losing water due to decreased water quality and quantity. We ask the State Water Board and Department of Water Resources work together to enforce this requirement in order to further promote drought preparedness across the state. Thank you, Board, for the opportunity to provide comments today.
Thank you, Ms. Rivers. Really appreciate the comments. And what does continue to be front of mind certainly are the fact that drought hasn't abated for many communities, and we are in the middle of still providing hauled water. And to your point, understanding the long term for our communities there as well around access, both on quality and quantity issues are intricately tied with all of this drought work and discussions. So just appreciate the comments and always the contributions. Thank you, Ms. Rivers. Next, I'd like to call up Regina Chicazola.
Hello, I'm Regina Chicazola, Executive Director with Save California Salmon. I am here today to talk about the temporary urgency change petition. There are a lot of things I would like to say, but first of all, I just wanted to say that I think that it would be good to acknowledge the fact that the current ESA requirements in the Delta are actually something that the state litigated against. The federal water plan that we call the Trump water plan is actually something that allowed the large-scale fish die-offs within the Delta. And then I also wanted to bring to the forefront that phase 1 and phase 2 of the Delta plan updates have not happened, and no updates have happened in decades. And I just think it's important to bring that up because we are in the middle of planning for these updates, right? Or I guess phase 1 did happen, it just hasn't been implemented. I'm sorry for that. Anyway, but you know, we are now looking at voluntary agreements to even take over phase 1. And so the reason I bring this up is I just want to bring up how extremely outdated and unprotective the environmental laws that we are now in a pattern and practice of allowing to be violated all the time are. And then I also wanted to echo and not spend a lot of time on what's been said about this is not a drought year. This is a normal water year, and it's now in front of this board to start allowing violations of water quality laws and environmental laws that it's your job to enforce during normal water years. And I just think that that's a plan of DWR, why they're also allowing increases in allocations is unbelievable, and that the state of California is willing to chance making multiple species endangered to deliver more water for 1 year, to me is just extremely insane. At this point, it feels like you might as well just throw any water quality control plans out because they're just being violated anytime anyone asks. It almost feels like a rubber stamp. And with that, I also wanted to bring up, there are other legal users of water that are being impacted through the fisheries. You know, there are fishermen that are going to be completely cut off from any fishing this year. They're a legal user of water. You know, tribes within the state of California are a legal user of water. This is not just, you know, some species that are going to be impacted. We're talking about the entire Delta, the San Francisco Bay, which just had a massive fish kill, like none that's ever been seen before. We've had so many fish kills over the last few years, and we finally have the opportunity for just a little bit of recovery. I think we know that if there are not good years for the Delta water quality, and if they're not good years for the fish, we're going to have extremely bad water quality in the Delta. We're going to have toxic algae blooms. We're going to have impacts to all different kinds of people. And if we don't have good years for the fisheries, the next step is extinction, and we are very close. And this is one of the first years we're looking at the impacts of the previous years of issuing these kind of waivers of the environmental laws and the first years of the extreme drought conditions we've had over the last 4 years. So, I know the board has already approved. To me, it's unbelievable. As you see, we don't have a lot of people here today. And we actually had a lot of trouble getting people even to come to the racial equity hearings because no one trusts this board to care about the voices of normal people. Everyone feels like all this board cares about is the agricultural community. And I know there's been a lot of steps taken over the last few years to do better, you know, to listen to the voices of more people. I very much appreciate it. I know there's plans in place for racial equity, and there's plans in place to do phase 1 and phase 2 updates. But ultimately, if you're just going to waive all the rules and laws every time it's asked of you, even in normal water years, and it could even end up being a good water year, then no one is going to have any trust in this board to protect them. And right now, none of the conservation of way of life or any of the things that are being put forward by the state are applying to agriculture. We're not asking them to do their job. And now we're, again, waiving environmental laws in a good water year just to provide them with a little more water. You can recover some fields, but you will never be able to recover the species that this board is allowing to go extinct. And you'll never be able to recover the way of lives for those fishermen, the tribes, and the recreational industries that are going to be impacted by the decisions you're making. So I am asking you to change course. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chicazola. Appreciate your contributions and advocacy here before the board. Thank you. Colleagues, anything further? Questions, comments? We will have further discussion and opportunity, certainly. And as I said, the period is still open for comments. We want folks to be participating in that. And I know there will still be further discussion here before us. But I appreciate, again, I know what are not easy circumstances on either side of all of that. And here the job of balancing that I know we take very seriously. And I know, I hear the passion. I know the frustration. And candidly, sometimes the flattening of what is otherwise a lot of rich work that this board has done over these last years to actually move the needle on what are generational challenges that we are all amongst us dealing with. So appreciate everyone's participation in the discussion here, and I think that concludes, unless Vice Chair.
I just want to thank staff and again thank Director Nemeth for the good discussion. Look forward to reading the comments. And I would just suggest that I'm assuming you're probably going to do this anyway, but in future drought updates to provide updates on the conditions, because I know there are a number of conditions in there, including on the actual numbers. The impacts are it's outlined as to what's expected, but it'll be great to see what actually plays out.
Thank you, Vice Chair. And thank you again for all the good work.
Chair Escobar, we do have
Yes.
one more person who would like to make a comment, if you'll
Yes,
allow.
by all means. Good morning. The microphone may not be on, so you may need to, the button is down there at the base. It's,
Is that it? I appreciate, I've never been at this board meeting. I appreciate the opportunity to speak briefly. I am a farmer. My name is Bruce Kennebrew. I also am a fisherman. I have my fishing gear in the car. And I fish, so I love both of those. And I want to tell you just briefly, I've learned stand up to be seen, speak out to be heard, and sit down to be appreciated, so I'll make this brief. I lost my well this last year, and I have a 17-year-old son who's black, if that means anything to anybody, talking about racial equity. And when you lose that, and then you're not able to pay workers, and you lose about a quarter of your crop because the water flow right next to my farm. I grow grapes in the South Valley here. When you lose that, you lose an income, which loses all kinds of other aspects of your life, schooling, et cetera, things like that go on. And I appreciate the work that the board is doing. I don't know all the ramifications of some of these things, but if you're thinking about the farmer, I appreciate that, because I am a farmer who lost my well, and it's because we didn't have ground charge go down in there as I watched the water flush out into the ocean when it could have come right by my property on the way there. It would have been nice to have that come through there, but because of water allocation not being able to, and it's being flushed out into the ocean, I have a difficulty with that. And I actually work for a company that monitors water in the Delta, so that's what I do. So I'm all for monitoring, but at the same time, I hate to see farmers like many around me losing their wells because the groundwater is going down. And we should be able to recharge that even in years like this, where the water could go through there and go down into the ground and not ruin the aquifer. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and didn't mean to, didn't see your name on the list, so I appreciate you making sure to come up and, yeah. Thank you for providing that comment. I think that concludes item number 3 then, and appreciate everyone's participation in what will be ongoing discussion around this action and all the balancing that this board continues to be called to do. So thanks. That brings us to item number 4, which I believe is board member reports. And so look to my colleagues to see if anyone would like to kick us off with report. As I pull up my own calendar then, sorry.
I can start. I just have one item. And so on February 13th, I was with you, Chair Esquivel, at the Lamont Public Utility District for an announcement of a $25.4 million grant. It was an honor to visit Lamont for the announcement of the SAFER grant. The funding will go to provide safe drinking water for Lamont and their neighbors in El Adobe. It was the second phase of improvements for their drinking water system, and it is the largest grant that has been provided to a single system to date from the SAFER program. It was great to attend the event and to be joined by DFA, DDW, and SAFER staff who all made the project possible. So I think it was a good day.
It definitely was, and I can just pick up there and just acknowledge it was a really good day. It was great to get down there. The Esquivel side of the family is from Bakersfield, so it felt good to get down into the region and appreciate that. You look at the work that we've been able to do around SAFER, the dollars we're getting out, and yes, we need to continue to focus on how to get those projects in sooner. But that timeline of 10 years of the human right to water, 6 or so years since the Division of Drinking Water was transferred over, and then 3 years here since the Safe and Affordable Fund, and we have incredible momentum. So it's great to be down there and to celebrate with folks and to be able to travel a bit with Nicole and one of our staff, Anna Melendez. I want to note on February 6th was, and I think we had actually a board meeting since then, but I don't know if I mentioned, there was the California Tribal Nations Summit. That was really great to be able to participate, to listen here mainly. And then also Secretary Garcia was there reflecting on, I know, the good work that is happening here at Cal EPA with our tribes and on water. And there, whether it's the Clear Lake Hitch, whether it's our work in the Scott and Shasta, the update of the Water Quality Control Plan update, all of these issues that we know are really tied to what are so many of the historic legacy challenges that we face in our water sector, but are tied to the way that we've treated our tribal partners, native Californians here, and so was appreciative of the discussion that was had there. On the 9th and 10th, I was actually in San Luis Obispo for the Diablo Canyon, a tour of the Diablo Canyon nuclear facility. I want to thank Jonathan Bishop for being there all 3 days. I was able to get down for 2, including a public meeting on the 10th in order to talk about our regulatory role and the regional board's role in the discussions around extension of that facility, what it means for once-through cooling and other items that are out there. The only other item that I would just flag was there was a Cal DSAL annual conference on the 16th here in Sacramento, and was able to participate in a panel there. There again, talking about the good work that Jonathan Bishop and folks in the Division of Water Quality and others are doing in order to advance how we might look at DSAL, support DSAL as an option amongst many that communities are right now evaluating. And topics of affordability certainly came up. Also, how best to develop projects, communities in mind, but also impacts in mind, so that they can go through quickly through our process and decision making. And so in ways that are protective and here don't lead to frustrations, I think, amongst a lot. So just want to thank everyone, and that's my report.
I just have 2. On February 8th, I went to Lake County, joined by Undersecretary Christy Birdsong from California Department of Food and Agriculture, and spent the day out there getting out to some of the creeks that we've been talking about with respect to the hitch. Met with a number of growers over at Lake County Farm Bureau, and then also had a meeting with the Big Valley Rancheria and a number of tribal leaders. I learned a lot. It was just an eye-opening day and a wonderful opportunity to build relationships. And really spent a fair amount of time with agricultural leaders, encouraging them to be open-minded and look at voluntary actions that they could be taking as we collect more information about the hitch. And I felt like the message was overall well received, and they've been really busy over there. Right before, I think it was the day before we were there, Lake County Board of Supervisors adopted a resolution, and they spent several hours on the item, and 2 weeks before they had also spent several hours on the item. So it's really at the top of everyone's agenda out there in the county, which was good to see. And then on the 15th, I participated in a panel at the National Association of Clean Water Agencies. They had their winter meeting in Sonoma, and the panel was making the right investments in a time of climate uncertainty. And I was kind of out of my league because there were a lot of financial wizards on the panel. And so it was interesting to hear their perspective on some of the challenges with financing in the face of climate change. And I just provided more of a California perspective, talked about the water supply strategy, how we're really trying to beef things up with recycled water and the strike team, and then also talked about the wastewater needs assessment, which I think they found that to be very useful in the discussion.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Board Member McGuire.
This board member does not have an update this time.
Thank you. Thank you, Board Member. That concludes Board Member updates. I believe we don't have an Executive Director's report for this week, so that actually concludes this board meeting. Just want to thank everyone for their participation, their comments. Our next board meeting will be March 7th. I don't believe we have any closed item sessions, so that concludes this board meeting, and we will see you all on March 7th. Be safe, be well, and really appreciate everyone's time and participation this morning. Thank you.